This is reading 4 of Embedded Contradiction, an issuance of dissonance into contemporary philosophy, an introduction to modular truth. Dialetheism and irony. Dialetheism is a type of contradiction in name alone. Some man of the Western philosophical cloth demanded from me once I entered into a chat room that I declared whether or not I was a theist or not, to which I said that there existed a double irony in my answer. I said, I'm not a theist of sorts. He said, that makes you a theist. What type of theist are you? And I told him, I am a dialetheist, which dumbfounded him, especially when I immediately followed up saying, and this type of theist has nothing to do with a god. Namely, it's a theism in name alone. Yet, it ironically speaks on how items and items of discourse can be considered to be contrary yet true. That man's online handle is Ozymandias, and he shied away for a while he investigated the topic. The claim that all atheists lack a belief in gods, is put forth to me to garner agreement. Mike, you would agree that all atheists lack a belief in gods, right? Steve McCrae asks me. Steve has subscribed to Ozzy's lacktheism idea and monopolized upon it. Lacktheism is the notion that some atheists do not believe in a God, which is different than atheists who lack a belief in God. I do not lack a third arm any more than I lack a belief, is one response. To scrutinize each word spoken or written when being questioned is quite important. So, do you think that all atheists lack a belief in God or gods? Reply, not necessarily. The argument can continue via the division between the words absent and lack. To divide synonyms or claims of words being synonymous is in order. I don't lack a third arm compared to I'm absent a third arm. Puts lacktheism per se to bed. The question of what one believes is often not a complex question when it comes to facts about the world, but becomes more difficult when talking about gods, namely the referent. The item being spoken on is most often vague. Even if one says, I believe in the Christian God, then all matters of fettering out which interpretation of which part of the Christian Bible and what manner do you believe in said God come into question. The philosopher simply aims to put God into a category same as if they were discussing answer boats or any item referenced within the empirical world. Philosophers are also poised to consider the proposition about a belief as opposed to discussing the phenomena claimed to be believed in. There exists a local shorthand for the sake of trite formulation. What one believes is B, and what one believes in is their claim, such that the claim being in the form of a short proposition puts that proposition adjacent to one's belief. So the question of what one believes is not pointing to the phenomena of the individual within attempted articulation, but to the articulation itself. Yet in the case of gods, one's reference is not precise, and one's relationship to said referent is not clear, perhaps even to the one speaking. But BP is the logical construct to summarize where P is the proposition there is a God. The question of what one holds or has becomes a preface via the interrogation of the philosopher, e.g., do you hold a belief in a God? This attempt to get a scrutinizable propositional claim from a person is part of the philosopher's current game, yet the limit to the insight this reveals is seen by some, such as myself, to be wrong-headed when assuming that all matters of belief are reducible to a preferred logical domain and refined as being rational. For could I not prefix the previous question with, do you consider supporting a holding the belief that a God exists? At some point a claim of redundancy would come into play, which would then question the word hold in the initial question as being unnecessarily redundant as it relates to simply asking, do you believe in a God? And supposing that one does not accept the do you hold a belief in God question without complaint, could they not question what holding means? What mentally holding supposes? Under what conditions, circumstances or time frames, a holding persists? The modern logical philosopher has the dilemma of having to first presume some foundation to their practice of declaring what is merely rhetorical with what is being put under symbolic replacement, i.e. HBP, holding a belief in proposition where proposition is God exists. Consider, Mike, do you lack a supporting consideration that holding a belief that God exists isn't a principle of parsimony, the presumed mode of reduction required by the lazy logician in these cases? The logician philosopher might say, stave away the idea as one being overly semantical or speaking necessarily within contemporary rhetoric. This is done with a huge degree of hypocrisy, yet, like in politics, it is a needed separation in order to keep their trend and method as supposedly pure as possible. Setting the stage in which my work applies itself or solves some particular problem, I'm injecting the work into the minds of the reader, not particularly in any hope of solving an unresolved problem that they might have, and I'm not presenting it as a thesis in which to necessarily respond or to question or to concern that anyone has had about any item of discourse, logical, illogical, paraconsistent logic per se, semantic or otherwise. I'm simply presenting this work more so as an art piece to stare at in a syntax museum, and let the viewer take away from or employ whatever extractions from the work which may look or appear or fill the void of having answered a question, fulfilled a utility, or solved some particular problem. And this isn't to say that I didn't have a vague notion of a problem when stating or attempting to problem solve, when creating some of the parts of this, as I have no notion that it matters either way nor in any case with regards to the possible array of people who might involve themselves into it, with any degree of insight into whom they, you, may be, what grounds they, you, stand on, which they, you, consider universal, and make you confident throughout the time of your being a member of a common language, being a member of a common species, I find variance to be as important as sameness, and so I do not want to underscore grounding in conventions of settings, the stage for speaking about language and logic in a manner which necessitates a notion that one must only read or engage a topic in order to further some gap in their knowledge for the sake of the utility of having solved a problem or having come across a solution to an answer. If the reader takes away a semblance of this work as filling a gap in thinking, understanding, knowing, considering, to which I, the author, refuse to speculate upon what that gap may be, then great. Talking about difference and sameness in the domain of perceiving the infinite entanglement of the finite unity. The jump-off point was an agreement where I wanted to press him on the negation of defacement the way I do, and opposed to disagreeing with their insertion about the defacement openness or clearing to the world. I speak of noses, and reduce being back not to body, but to locus, and locus of being in part behind another's eyes. We also spoke of pre-ontologic or pre-ontological knowledges, where I spoke of epistemology's reduction to a priori domain, and experience and ontology to a posteriori domains. Marty, graduate student in Texas, Marty mentioned different ontological orientations, e.g., I'm a student when at university, I'm a carpenter when working, relation to the cosmos, etc., and denoted many different domains to which I spoke of a reapproach to doing away with all divisions and all differences. The impossibility to just see the world as homologous or completely unified was asserted, to which I retorted that it was possible that the demand for the release of the differences decentered one's internal monologue and left one insane and walking through walls in attempt and losing spatial orientation and peeing oneself, etc. I tried to flesh that area out to him, mentioning that exclusion could be considered as cleavage, whereby only via a hyperbola one category cleaved away from the other, giving the notion of exclusion and difference. Then I spoke of the maintenance of the duality for the sake of sanity, but then criticized the notion that between difference and unity there was a preference often held for one and lesser towards the other, whereby a duality could be seen in a contrapposto, asymmetric manner. Used clown balloons as non-equal dualisms, where one side could be inflated and the other deflated, even popped and blown out. And that one could have sympathies towards the deflated or the inflated, the overly inflated. Add illustration back from page 62 in notes, which is not here. Frege and Priest. Frege's theorem substitutes objects with concepts and does so in a manner where 5 is greater than 6, for example. This is a second-order logic which couples variables in different object-concept domains in an either true or false biconditional. Concerning the left to right, or the process read, or process of a read, of x equals x or x1 equals x2, see Frege's letter to Russell about the acceptance in problems with left and right equivocation. This is done in a manner of adding a principle of making a set where, in order to be greater than 5, the other element must also be coupled with being an odd number. And since 6 is not odd, it would reside in a true-false dichotomous theorem as being false, where all false objects are considered lesser than. In this case, lesser than 5. Note derivation from Hume where it relates to the left to right read. An interesting thing about words and their semantic meanings as they come to be commonly used within language and develop entanglements of meaning, such as connotations. Frege, it seems, was able and willing to swap out the words true and false with that which is affirmed or denied, respectively. In much the same way, in many United States legal filing procedures, a lawsuit is either a plaintiff versus a defendant or a petitioner versus a respondent. There exists a nuanced distinction here whereby we can release our grip on the historically weighted word true, which has a claim and burden traditionally entailed by its use in philosophical discourse. To speak of truth as a priori speaks to the excluded middle, empirical world, domain, and when one claims that domain, variable, or assertion is true, the claimant is brought into a type of court, in this case a philosophical court, where the claimant is said to have the burden of proof to supply evidence and attempt to prove their claim, their truth claim. When we supplant Frege's biconditional true or false with affirm or deny, when one uses the word affirm a statement, the philosophical court does not require a strict burden of proof of that which one affirms. Where truth or falsity speaks on objective claims generally, affirmation and denial speaks often from the phenomenological subjective domain. Hardly anything more unwelcome can befall a scientific writer than that one of the foundations of his edifice be shaken after the work is finished. This is the position in which I was put by letter from Mr. Bertrand Russell as the printing of this volume was nearing completion. Frege, 1903. Excuse me. Graham Priest's Logical Disputes, page 352, quote, "Rejecting A and accepting not A are quite distinct mental states. Even leaving diletheism aside, most people have inconsistent beliefs, with or without realizing it. They accept both A and not A for some A fortiori. Instead of a posteriori or a priori, it's a fortiori. They do not reject A, moreover, uttering a sentence of the form not A may indicate a rejection of A. It may not. Page 354, a word on the use of the word logic here. Logic is ambiguous. It can mean both the theory of an investigation and the subject of an investigation. In the same way, the word dynamics is ambiguous. Page 360, we may suppose people will, and it's obvious that Osama bin Laden is identical to lowercase Osama bin Laden. if this is put to them, even though they have never thought about it before, and for exactly the same reason, it follows that the law of identity, x equals x, by an instance of universal instantiation, the validity of which is obvious. Thus, if we can obtain something from obvious statements by the application of inference, the validity of which are obvious, the results are obvious, at least as long as we do not have to apply too many inferences. The number of applications must be rather small. Page 361. Grandpeace continues. Logic is involved in the process of rational choice. The mechanism of choice, therefore, presupposes logic, and this cannot be used to justify logic itself. That must receive a different a priori justification. Page 364. But as we have also seen, these results can be overturned should we come to accept a theory according to which they are mistaken. End quote. Consider the idea of vicious regress as in alignment and agreement with exhaustive reduction. My term, exhaustive atheism, compared to grounding out, aka hitting bedrock with the spade turned up. Back to Frege. Consider a matter to content with Frege's arithmetical function. It seems that the idea of a function is to define and stabilize the variable which will be used in the equation to follow. So to oppose Frege on this might be to assume an ongoing non-exhaustive variable functions, instead of implying Occam's razor and reducing symbols and items to the least complex. Could we not destabilize arithmetical function by always requiring that the function be composed of at least two variables, and oftentimes the exhaustive number of variables? F of x, x plus 2 equals z. We might say fxy, left parenthetical, xy plus 2, right parenthetical, equals z. And continue with fxy1, left parenthetical, xy1 plus 2 equals z, where each additional variable is an aspect or attribute of the original x, but may be segmented away from x and applied to g. fxb1t8, left variable xb1 tb plus 2 equals y, where Frege dealt with symbols in logic as they relate to some, many, all, etc. I propose statements of consistency which, like Frege's thinking, makes x general to all items which it represents. In this case, say x is the variable for cows, such that x implies all cows, where y is the variable for all browns, such that the functional variable would denote a specific class of brown cows, where the number 1 might be a particular type of brown. So for all x's, xy1, where now we could replace x, cows, as the function with xy1, which just variables for a specific brown y1, such that y now refers to the aspect of brownness, and 1 a specific brown, which could be applied to other nouns. The main effect of this exhaustive stream of aspects related variables is that a reduction from the most general, all variable, we would have a quite specific variable at play, e.g. x equals John would mean all people named John, with Frege's system where x John Travis Robertson, born 11/4/90, has brown hair and eyes and plays racquetball on Wednesdays, lives in Pittsburgh, is a function, might be JTR-BO49OB1B2RBWP, where any variable might be changed with new information, e.d. John dyes his hair blonde and plays racquetball on Tuesday, lives in Oakland now. JTR-B11O4901B2RBTOC. Certainly, categorization of any type on the planet can be indexed already, and the point of showing up a rudimentary shift to our Frege's arithmetical function to include second tentative variable is to uniformly destabilize the predicate function itself. This exercise in possibility of maintaining a symbolically shifting grammar which itself holds tentatively and temporarily, such that X for Lincoln, where X was alive but now is dead, requires a factual shift, variable, disjunct, with Frege, but in the ongoing non-exhaustive variable functions method, if it was sound and codified, the fact of Lincoln's death would be a part of a reduced function itself, e.g. f. Capital X, A, L, P, D, left bracket, X, A, L, P, D, etc., right bracket. In death, a member of Project Mayhem has a name. His name is Robert Paulson. Fight Club. Side note, the benefit of adding non-exhaustive function would essentially be that the item in question would be probabilistically certain prior to using arithmetic to find its mathematical relational equivalent. Contradiction is not on the table when initial description is already given. The idea is not mentioned because it is a rigorous mathematical idea. More or less, I mention this as a means to upset the predicate itself, the noun itself, the static idea of states, the states of affairs, or the denoting of facts of ephemeral situations is in preference to the discrete delineation of distinct facts. The preference of this writing is to sway or budge the noun or static state, the state of indexing, to the verb and moving perceptions one has when casually noting a person indexing nouns. It is to prefer the verb over the noun and to do so without abandoning the noun altogether. Netty netty, not this, or not this, neither that. The not operator is generally understood and used in colloquial ways which don't confuse day-to-day conversation. It's exclusionary and discrete by nature, but it is often used where non would be more appropriate. Within basic propositional logic, the phrase, "I'm not a Christian," means that the category Christian is excluded from the category I with regards to the speaker of the proposition. This is to say that the speaker is not within the subset of the category Christian, and Christianity is not considered an aspect of the speaker. Within the strictness of propositional logic, a double negation eliminates negation altogether. To say the ball is not blue means that the ball is blue. The meaning conveyed, semantics per se, by a speaker are a bit more nuanced than what a sterile propositional logic presumes. For example, if I say I am not a Christian may yield two different indexes, like the blue ball. A stereological analysis would think that I am saying I am Christian. But another index might be that I mean I'm not entirely a Christian, or I have Christian attributes. These later examples open up the categories Christian and I. This is to say it pluralizes what it is to be X, where X is a Christian, and Y, where I is I. The no true Scotsman fallacy might be applied to what being a true Christian is, and as well as opening self-reflection up with considerations of what constitutes the I, to ask oneself what possible attributes of myself might qualify as being aligned with Christianity, where I, the author, find many attributes of my being which I think align with Christianity, whereby I don't make an identity claim that I am a Christian as my ritual behavior and prayer process don't fit within what I conceive to be Christian. But my values and higher power, titling often make reference to Jesus. My knowledge of supernatural entities also leaves me in a type of tentative congruence with a Christian God, such that a semi-article read of my statement that I am not a Christian seems applicable. The reader might want to investigate neutral monism for greater considerations of this case. I say not the category at hand and not an exclusion of the category at hand either. The most voluminous object in this illustration is not a triangle. It is also not a circle and not a square, but it's not a triangle from a specific perspective, or because it has triangle-esque aspects, meaning that the object is in contradiction when the contradiction requires the concept of each mental idea be projected onto an empirical item, where the empirical item is the referent and the object is also in contradiction because it is a square circle, a square triangle, and a circle triangle, and it is also not any of these. It is a circle, and it is not, depending on aspect disclosure, where the aspect is the perspective and the disclosure is another perspective. As far as not operators, we can speak of not operators as not operators when one speaks, using merely the phonological phrase, I'm not a Christian. The parenthetical brackets limits are not denoted in the speech, as the phonic process does not yield how one is to consider how the subject is parsed from but held to a sentence. In this case, below, we consider P. Illustration, not P, then not symbol P, then not left parenthetical, not symbol, left parenthetical, not symbol, left parenthetical P, right parenthetical, compared to not symbol, left parenthetical, not symbol, P, right parenthetical. Right? And then down below we showed the domain, which is not. We show the separation of the symbology, where the not P, where there's parentheticals that separate the first not from the P, we have a different displacement than if we simply use not P, right? And so the diagram is to indicate that. P or not P are held as central to the statement. If P is central, then P is parsed off from the primary, not operator. If not P is central, then second, not operator, is parsed off by the parentheses. Without a graphic syntax, confusion or ambiguity is on the face of the statement. Even with the graphic syntax, we have to further distinction. Neither P, next illustration for those only listening, says neither P nor not P, and then the symbolic diagram of not left parenthetical, not left parenthetical P, right parenthetical, right parenthetical, compared to not P, defined as not left parenthetical, not P, right parenthetical. Now the direction of attention towards or away from P is entailed within the word not, especially within the second not operator. Consider that bachelor ambiguity, many chapters above. In this case, we have a bachelor, not a bachelor, and not a bachelor, such that a bachelor is what a man phenomenologically considers his status. A not bachelor is the absenting of this status, or displacing away of the status. In the case where the bachelor cleared his throat and did not intend the throat clearing as an affirmation to the question, do you take this woman to be your wife? Yet the community does recognize the sound as an affirmation of the marriage. We can find that the not bachelor, illustration once again, the illustration says bachelor, and it shows a B inside of a square domain where the inside of the domain is denoted. And then we show not bachelor, where there's a domain of B and an exterior domain with arrows pointing towards the domain bachelor, as if bachelor was an absence, not a bachelor. Then we have not a bachelor, which is the empty set minus the B indicator, and not a bachelor would be the same domain without the B with arrows pointing outward. From merely a propositional read of negation, all even operators affirm the subject. In this case, P, where not P means P, and all odd-numbered operators mean the denial of subject, in this case, not P. But when assuming that natural or colloquial language is under scrutiny, the double negation may mean or infer a type of approximation. A traditional Venn diagram might be the domain of P is at the center of and a subset of not P. Suppose that all things not P are of the equivalent in volume and size. Quantity, amount, totality, etc. to P, such that we can represent not P to P as P in one domain, not P in another non-tangential domain. Let's now grant a dimensional extruding to both P and not P domains such that they have volume. So then we show P as a volume within space and not P as a volume in space. Now consider a three-dimensional relational model. P and not P are defined below. Let's say that P is like the subjective description of bachelor noted above, and not P is denoted as external reification of a bachelor status from an external or communal identification. And we have another illustration trying to show top orthographics of the P and not P domains being sharing a same axis as one another and being butted up parallel next to one another. And then we show the P and not P top orthographic of these voluminous Venn diagrams of such, where they share a tangent on a corner and they're at 90 degrees to one another, and then where they are butting the smaller edge, and then they're imbricated like tiles where not P and P are share a tangential domain. And then if we rotate the axis of the P and not P, we could look at them as transparencies, where like light is shining through a common domain of P and not P, And then we can show if the transparencies are actually an integration into the same domain, once again a top view, then we could say that there's an intersection between material of P and not P, or eidetic mental, or the categories that are not referent of any items in the world that are shared. So, and then we're back to the text. In the bottom illustration above, P and not P hold in part the same space at the same time. Then we're showing P and not P as if, on this illustration for those listening, like two dimes or nickels, let's say, that are intersecting each other perpendicularly. And so it's showing that they would go through one another, so to speak. Here we see a perpendicular intersection of P and not P. So now we have a perpendicular intersection between P and not P, like two coins that share space, and that both of these domains of P and not P are also intersecting another coin-like voluminous domain to refer to of not P. And then we're back to the text. False dichotomy. Wearing mismatched socks, when the idea of a match is a mirror of the dichotomous nature of feet. Let left and right feet naturally mirror together the fact of one's matched and unmatched socks. Match mirror that mirrored a match. Why contradiction? Identical siblings who marry other identical siblings, where both couples have kids, the cousins are genetically equivalent to the siblings. Similar to two non-parallel hallways which share a common end wall, where the shadow of the one object within one hallway may be mistaken for the absence of the shadow of the identical object of the other hallway. Where one's own perceived non-shadow may be confused for someone else's shadow. And then there's another illustration showing two halls that have an intersecting shadow. Only one of them has light being cast from it, but both of them conceptually could be said to be of the shadow, minus the light being known. And, okay, so we continue. And why would anyone want contradictions to be true? Numeral 2, lowercase b, to be true. For the same reason, you have a left and right arm, the mirror of a mental opposite, like the vertical axis going down. Human's body splits the vertical axes evenly, generally. In this case, though, one of the arms is mangled. Or you have two left arms and only one right arm, wondering where your second right arm is, or isn't. One would want a contradiction to be true in order to open up a limitation of their thinking as well as a limitation assumed of the world. Psychologically speaking, the reason you wouldn't want a contradiction to be true or false is because it's so much like a disease, like a painful rash, or it's like a parasite, an affective parasite, such that it diminishes the host's body knowingliness, and because such things may debilitate oneself into a contrapposto posturing, like losing your nerve function on the right side of your face, where a smile looks like a profile of a water slide. You wouldn't want contradictions to be true if you wanted to keep your mind sane, your being sane, lose productivity, utility, and function. You wouldn't want it to be true because you would have the option of infinitely falling forward while perhaps losing your ability to come back. And why? Because the borders, the rules, the method of implementing that which could draw you back would itself be into contradiction. In other words, you might just lose ground altogether, deny gravity, and jump off of a roof, not to kill yourself, but just because you implemented the contradiction about the answer to whether gravity can be willed away or not. And because the answer would be yes and no, the domain in which it's yes would be a logical space, which doesn't currently map into physics, or does it? The rational answer is of course not. Not all logics reflect the physical world. Some argue that logics are mental facts. For if they did, and there were a logical space which applied to physics where gravity didn't exist, then why not grant yourself a faithful first test? How jumping off a building 1 or 2 stories high enough to damage you without killing you? One might say, why put one's body in peril for a test? And the answer is, it's because it is the faith in the possible damage resulting is that which makes one's faith either true or false, and true and false, by the mere act of behavior in a counterintuitive and counterfactual way. All in a great deconstructionist life. A good job for deconstructionists is to reduce, remove, or clean away landfills and pollute waterways. Anyway, I might interject here as the reader and say there could be a spiritual effect to such a jump that is not necessarily a material effect, or one might say an intelligible physical effect. Okay, so anyway, back to the text. The text on the paper is as follows. The question by Bert Poole, that if you can have contradictions, which one do you accept and which do you reject? Even if the ideal, nihilism, or some form of meaningful singularity can be denoted or arbitrarily ascribed to a strata, is to become the limit from which the human engaging in contradiction might survive. The mental survivability or mere biological survivability requires Goldilocks zone. That is the plane through the reduction, the conal reduction of one's telon. The plane represents a wall to deflect the fall into nihilism and reflectively also not into the ideal, or the plane has a width which describes the Goldilocks zone. If the singularity is a form of realistic nihilism, then it is to be rejected or transferred attention to the intersection with the plane, or the plane itself. Because the plane is not the cone, but is also not of the cone. An abandonment of living forever or forever within a biospag is presumed. Inspired by Bert Poole, informed by YouTube streamer Malpass, and Slick, part of moral reconstructive practices. Page drawing X. Post-explosion, what to do? When logical explosion occurs, when a contradiction exists, is true, the focus should not be on the fact that any variable can now be substituted as arbitrary, but the question, what variables do the individual substitute as the replacement variables? An inventory should be registered by the person focusing upon the contradiction and what they specifically say about logical explosion, e.g., if every A is true, then all statements are true. So A may mean a dog, a giraffe, or the color white, whiteness. Also, trying to solve again whether the contradiction is true should be reanalyzed during the inventory process. One should also start group dumping and categorizing the different substitutions that they find filling the gap of any. Different categories and classes can then be associated by kind in different rings of strata, like Saturn's rings might exist in a correspondence to the inventory in a geometric metaphor. Contradictions as a structure, set structure. What constitutes a contradiction? Beyond a variable and its antecedent, opposite, negation. A prior x to the not x is the antecedent. A contradiction shown in graphic Venn diagrams first yield a binary and inclusive space or present or there-ness or definition, which is the A or a domain, whereby the exclusive domain is considered the exclusion of not A. Yet one could reduce the non-not domain of A to another domain, such that instead of left bracket not A, the parenthetical A, right parenthetical, not A, right bracket, we can express left bracket, left parenthetical A, right parenthetical, left parenthetical not A, right parenthetical, right bracket. But in order to show the contradiction, we must have a shared or complete domain. Left bracket, left parenthetical A, left parenthetical, right parenthetical, not A, right parenthetical, right bracket, or left bracket, left parenthetical, A, not A, right parenthetical, right bracket, where a thing is and is not. From half envelope sketch illustration on back of 62, or maybe an envelope sketch. Some side note. Next chapter, psychological stellation. Remember to think of the stellation of, pointed above, as X, but consider thinking of reduction or approaches to telos or telons or singularities in a bent curved space such that the up marker would be more akin to N. Side note, like two cucumbers end to end, indicating a stellation off the end of one cucumber to the next. Absent illustration. Whereby the cross section or planes which run through any portion of the cucumber without yielding a parabola per se are used as strata limitations, two parallel or like parallel planular cross sections on the same cucumber half show the domain limitations, whereby if one falls into psychological explosion, then their body's survivability comes into question, as they, person experiencing the explosion, may start behaving outside the conditioned domain of physical possibility. In lieu of accepting logical possibility which has no physical correlate, the person may also function via behavior outside of all social normative, such that mere heterodox normativity is a conservative description of this person's behavior, social. In order to reel back from the edges of insanity or total obtuseness, silent self-deconstruction. See post on Discord with regard to Sket X, CX segments above. lead pyramid stellation into cone to conal stellation, where parabola becomes hyperbola and where hyperbola become dandelion or Dandelion sphere theory, whereby migrating identification with a sphere within a dandelion sphere moves one's identity into a mirrored contradiction, like hourglass. Not X doesn't equal X, but the migration into the not domain, whereby one becomes a ghost or submits themselves to a zombie philosophy, whereby one could say that the internal monologue is derailed and found at least part in parcel outside of one's internal thoughts domain, aka the loss of the internal monologue. After one's internal monologue becomes one's external monologue and is attempting to become internal again, the external monologue is supplanted with one's environmental meaning making data. The signs, symbols, words, and media which convey meaning become transferable with one's reassigning their monologue back to the internal realm. When one has this derailment of internal monologue and regains it later, one could be said to have entangled the outside world wholeheartedly as the periphery of their personal consciousness. We're showing an illustration of a focal point, kind of like a pupil, and the arrow would be pointing to the pupil from, let's say, the interior of the eyeball. And that's what's being denoted here in the illustration on the left. And this is compared to the illustration on the right, which shows from a focal point, not a discrete center, but from a center, we have one's periphery, or an arrow pointing to the inside periphery of the eyeball, let's say. This is done when one forgets to utilize the identification process as an artifice and has instead consumed identity and forgets what it last had for dinner. Side note, mirror of a logical space mirrored with two axes, four squares together which mirror its tangential mirrors. If the quad of mirrors was spinning, it might be described illustrated with a swastika shape, sort of like a squaring, a yin-yang sign, where the inner circles within each half are interactions of diagonals. If a dandelion ball was orthographically grounded to the yin-yang sign. I thought this could also be a response to C.M. Langen's, Christopher Michael Langen's, The Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, a new kind of reality theory, where he speaks of a tautological manifold upon our collective yet greater vision of how our language and syntax are supposedly embedded within reality, in science, in ideas, yet speaks of it terms of a manifold without a leak, as if an engine manifold without the right sealer gasket won't leak or exude. In all fairness, he does speak of language as information in transit. I paraphrase, this paper is about the leakage of the fully always ever inclusive being within a manifold of reality. Perhaps I desire to know the volatility from within and what is calm external to oneself, as if a cosmic wasn't impossible. How does one like myself actually propose that a thing in the world isn't a thing in the world? This seems absurd, as we collectively share a language, and not only that, we share the ability to translate our language into other languages. Since most humans share like bodies in common, which have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 hands, 2 feet, since we all bend forward more naturally at the hip than backwards, our physiology is known to be roughly the same as the next human. Because of this, we notice how a prelingual infant reaches out into the world as if to grasp things which are well out of its reach. This out-of-reach yearning, accompanied with a reaching, are the first ideas constituting the rule of pointing. Pointing can be towards any object, beyond the reach or within the reach of the person. The pointing is one of the main first rules which guide our grammatical structure. This occurs when one is pre-articulate. One is to read a person's bodily communication of pointing by noting the common orientation of their body towards an X object. An infant sees its pointing are responded to by the accompanying adults. The pointing accompanied also by the word, as to denote the X object can be mimicked, a point and an accompanying word. Or to this is X, and then pointing to this X is an X, a coupling of sense data. So why attempt to defunct this law of identity at all? The first distinction to defunct identity, or propose that a thing was not itself, had to do with exchanging the assumed item with another grammatical function, such that one may have been pointing to a shirt on the ground, but the foreign speaker is pointing at the adjective of being dirty. So the new person, prior to further use and iteration and clarification, assumes that the word for shirt is dirty. So in short, the first reason to defunct the law of identity is misunderstanding, miscategorization, mistaking, and assuming that an aspect of a thing is the thing. A second reason to assume that an item in the commonly referenced world is that objects in the world tend to change character based on context of lighting, based on prepositional orientation, and sometimes contrast or contrast's obfuscation. Namely, a navy blue car in day may be black car at night. The border between an X car may not be clear as to its contrasting background, where shape is misunderstood, so that the item itself is misunderstood. Once again, requiring further reiterative exposure to said item at different times, proximities, and lighting. Giddier cases. An artist may group an outline of a car with a person standing in front of the car, such that the outline indicates both a person and a car, but is represented as one outline. Outline P, such that P might encapsulate many supposed differing items, X's, but all be within one single P grouping, such that the items within are now conditioned to be seen as merely P props. When one considers the idea of the nature of matter and items of discourse, and when one considers differing perspectives about the nature of other beings, a post facto reanalysis can leave someone who just came out of the movie The Matrix to consider the irreality of all items of discourse. That what one considered to be of some particular nature about an item X was to be held in a differing manner than merely practical, empirical, and tangible. If one considers the nature of other minds in their thoughts, the person may come to the notion of solipsism and assume that people are mere a type of avatar of the self, and not really an item X where X is over there, out there. Or how one might find drastic importance in one item as they understand it to have a more serious need of attention given to it and its possible relational states above and beyond another item, i.e. that guy isn't just a guy, he is a murderer. Yet another reason to defunct identity is to note a subgroup of humans' convention about some X items whereby their propositional orientation dictates their name, i.e. in the West, often a pine tree is merely an evergreen tree which holds a proximity out there in the woods, but once per year brought indoors, the pine tree now becomes a Christmas tree by merely a shift of its contextual realm. This is different than a tree becoming lumber. But the idea that when an item is in identity transit from one classification to another, the indexing timeline of the shift, in this case, of when a tree becomes lumber, one is left in a debate. This is diachronics. Not too dissimilar to the debate about when conception becomes greater than merely fertilized cells and is categorized as that species. Another type of identity definition is imagining a subtraction of commonly held relational states such that humans tend to move indoors more often when weather circumstances become less desirable. A sprinkle is accepted, but rain is an increase of an undesirable environment, a heavy rain even more, and a hurricane is avoided in most cases for one's survival. One may believe in a God that punishes the people of one's environment for the wrongdoing of that individual. Perhaps a hurricane came because the individual believes she did something wrong in a previous or concurrent context. To subtract relational states as one comes to believe them is a part of learning a nuance in language about friction and non-friction, truth from lies. But in learning that Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy are not real items of one's previously held grouping of identities is a type of understanding that a held symbol for an X entity with a Z function is no more Santa Y is now not Y, and this is different than referencing a contemporary person whom then dies in the same manner, but with the understanding that the physical, tangible aspect of C person is now merely the content of the old C person, the old identity, missing certain elements whereby a person who was C person is now lowercase c person. One may also purposely go cross-eyed or toy with their senses as to apprehend an obscure or differing number of the same item being referenced such that the item's identity comes into question. Requires another common language speaker to confirm one's account or show how the function of the human organisms is out of line, whacked, or defunct itself. So identity can be and is reapproached, and under these waves of reapproach are made both more obscure and more understood within the greater realm of considerability. It is within the reapproach to what is commonly understood by our species where we have our limbs as yearning pointing devices, accompanied by precise recursive language categorization, which distribute a clarity within agreement of common language speakers that an item X is in fact an X, and within this agreement held confidently within its utility towards X item's function or place in the world, mundanely that we confidently and with no doubt call X X. And notice notices that others within our common language speaking community function with X item in like manner to oneself. Only when one seems to not be calling the same item the same, or behaving or speaking peculiarly about X item, that one might have to draw attention to where disagreement seeps in. Of the three laws, axioms, principles of logic, which frame our linguistic grammars as symbolic meta-languages, rule bases, identity, the law of identity is the hardest to make or show as defunct. The process of making some group of variables not themselves relies on as many of the variables not in question maintaining their specific identified status as being themselves. So only upon a shift in what may be a change in identity beyond merely history and other semantical contexts about X item, we can move our attention to that domain as if we exchanged a sandbox for quicksandbox in our yard, but not in our heads. It is referred to as the former and assumed to be and behaved like the former, a sandbox. It holds itself at a distance as the self-same identical structure to what it isn't quite anymore. A foil, a counterfeit, a duplicate, a replica of a differing form, use, behavior than what one is conditioned to assume. It is because of language's ability to self-correct in some manner that people believe that all differences about variables can be clarified, hence ending the quicksand identity within the sandbox and showing our attention to the regular normative expectations of said sandbox. Anything beyond the norms upsets the uniformity of nature appeal. People like to see unnormative behavior because it is just that, anything beyond unnormativity with regards to shifting of identity, or an emergence of an unidentifiable new variable, seems to fall within the category of magic, the super-fantastical, or the supernatural. These classes of cases are pejoratively often dismissed or not overly focused upon as needing to be taken seriously, although it is within these supposed magical domains that identity comes once again into question, in doubt, or in flux, or in explication. It is with a concurrence of multiples of these defunctionary categories in Congress working on one's disinvolvement with identities, which then, by the hopes of a de-foundationalist philosopher, can expand to question the basis of identity beyond merely that which is in doubt, but to that which isn't in doubt nor in question. The process is not unlike sensing the world of matter as electric bits, which our body can test as reliable instead of illusory, but with the caveat that all material items of one's apprehension through the eyes are not testable by the haptic, tangible aspects drawn from touch. One's hands and one's arms to sense qualia of X items is real. But you nor I will not rub every inch of cement, metal, or stone making up the exterior and interior of a skyscraper so exhaustively and in lieu of time or the desire to test all observed items as being these items. Verification is granted over, and the individual submits to basic assumptions of knowledge about claimed items seen by themselves at a distance or by others. Seeing is enough to believe. In the day of modern photography, green screens and computer-generated imagery, CGI, Many people now are more conditioned to question variables as trustworthy as actually being the case. The timing to open up the questions about whether a thing and x is merely itself x equals x or x equals x1 is ripe, even to open the idea that x does not equal a correspondence to reality in a new case where it is once assumed to, but to relegate the questionable domain to visual correspondence is appropriate. To gaslight someone or to put over baseless pretenses upon another are good ways to start dismantling of identity, one's psychological identity, whereby even the most insane person who has lost any acceptable rules of language or sensual proximity to an item's distance from or in orientation to other items often let domains of the imagination take over the day-to-day function of the real world, but not without obvious quirks, which are viewable by those considered rational and sane. As virtual reality and echoing media advance, which further the disjunct with our reality as we humans have claimed it as normative and coherent, we teach our infants with language about what the world is now met with media that distances the traditional parent-to-child vocal learning with a new media environment. Language is used to re-meet a form-fitting unification with the world. The world of artificiated environments is present. To find this form-fitting, one might assume that all occurrences have a seat in the universe world, yet only sense it via the type of echoing of topic with observable empirical occurrences. A meta-narrative generally describes this occurrence of coincidence and recognizing parallel happenings. The insanity with coming to a domain where fewer things are accepted as identical to themselves than not is a type of psychological recapitalization with one's prelingual being. When the world was a watery blur and the parents handled us as infants in space, temperature, warmth, and affections prior to our ability to do much ourselves, identifying oneself to the prelingual domain of the infantile for a period of time helps us reassert ourselves into our thoughts. This dismantling process of one's psychological identity is a type of striving to make oneself an idiot, a primitive of our postlingual being, similar to an Ouroboros. Usually madness comes to those whose luck or assumptions didn't line up with an assumed trajectory in life, and one becomes derailed and lives in a type of existential wreckage. A physically and or mentally damaged person at best falls into heterodox normative relation states with the supposedly healthy population of humans. These pariah then relegate themselves, orient themselves and their conduct to the in-group of other pariah differently than in-group of the normal people, the norm. The distinction of difference is notable and observable, yet differences within the normal population may be greater than differences between the normal population and the pariah population. To denote differences requires one to assume an acceptable sameness in a greater population. Perhaps the rule structure which makes an idea valid is accepted and agreed upon to be the same between a language user and their common language using population. Difference is denoted when the content or the variable is not sound or agreed upon, and the domains of difference overwhelm the domain of sameness, then de-foundational logics begin to be applicable. Or one might say that de-foundational logics assert themselves. The attempt to align differences and samenesses into a domain of what is similar or what resembles what is tackled by many authors and academics, but it is here that paraconsistent logic has its place. Where the analytic philosopher attempts all categorization to be a mere object class denotation or ascription, which can be commonly held and understood such that all categories and issues of unclarity can be reduced to points and categories of clarity. The continental philosopher allows themselves to step back and accept the exhaustion of the reductionary as an attempt of the analytic philosopher, and sense themselves wading into waters of change, flux, and difference, such that greater, more flowery bouquet, growing, robust categorization can encompass an array of many items, such that the individual and his being come under greater and greater re-identifications via great breadth of association without losing one's name. But all of this chapter is really to express how the principle of identity, when oneself is the object of identity, can be dismantled from those able and willing to do so. To make oneself the object of self-difference, the object of scrutiny opposed to scrutinizing, a cup pivots the source of scrutiny from the ontological to the phenomenological. It's a good starting point to begin with oneself and then disclaim fixed identities of objects in the world as holding a consistent identification identity. A fold in the universe that one can't seem to iron out might not be a fold at all, but a seam. Michael Fahl, author. The narcissism of the author, which invites self-quoting in order to contain the idea away from the reader, such that the quote, my self-quoting, is both redundant while perhaps being most necessary. A logic that mentions tangents in imbricated relations to one another. X is in an imbricated relationship with all Y's that share any common domain with X. Y is in an imbricated relationship with all Z's that share any common domains with Y. X does not necessarily share a common domain with Z. If X, Y, and Z and Y about X about equals Y, or Y about equals Z, then X does not, or X about equals Z and X does not equal Z. A noun. N is to make nouns a subset of verbs, to obscure the orthodox noun-verb relationship with regards to identity and equivalence in identicals, adverbs, the domain of all propositionally referential language functions. Now, in intersection with all referentially corresponding language functions. N, all synthetic correspondence. Compartments and modules for truth rafts. Use propositions, predicate logic, set theory, symbols, graphs, geometry. My philosophy generally is that the problem with people is that they believe what they think. When that problem occurs quite often me, mostly when I break integrity in order to denote by defilement. To defile the constituent tenuous fact that people have to adhere to some segment of language regardless of other people's adherence to how it lays down upon the world and describes being, and can do all that it does do, including writing this paragraph. whose initial virtue was to believe all that one believes, then remove that belief, such that one is the most pre-foundational being, whereby meaning of a sound or the ring of meaning may take on a totally different role. That is to say that from the most ethereal or lightest gas point of view, language is boundless away from the world and becomes quite a bit of an act more so than the means of communication, which if no physiological violence occurs, all human expressions have a need to come out. Another oddity is that enfolding one within one's guilt blanket or love blanket paradigm of self-comfort will stop one from dying, asks one to ask themselves if one does in fact die, the telos denied through mental ideas, the knowing that ideas do stem from the human heart and mind, orientation and intent. The reflexive nature of our language allows us to go through changing relationships of data in our mind and in our lives, but many people like whom they are associated with because they are happy in their body, mind, and social circumstances. These people are happy in their lives. This is the end of this reading of Embedded Contradiction and Issuance of Dissonance into Contemporary Philosophy, an Introduction to Modular Truth. Let's pick up the next recording.